Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nick Cooper. I'm the Group Executive Director of Insights and Analytics at Landor&FITCH. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this next stage in the Landor&FITCH 24-hour extraordinary webinar. As some of you will know, it started in Sydney sometime in the wee hours, opened up by our Chief Executive, Jane Geraghty. We've now reached London, and then we'll be going on in about 12 hours' time to reach San Francisco. What I would like to do today is talk a bit about the context around these extraordinary times that we have, to try and put some perspective around what we're seeing, and also to try and understand what might happen next. So the title of my talk is really about from an economic perspective, is it rebound, recovery, or recuperation? I think as a first port of call, I think it's really important to try and get some perspective on what we're seeing, because there are a lot of unknowns, but I think the first step would be to compare what we're seeing now with other similar-ish pandemics. And we have to go back about 100 years to get some comparators to this. The Spanish flu, just after the First World War, killed, depending on who you look at, somewhere between 20 and 50 million people. And then we had the Asian flu in the 50s and Hong Kong flu in the 50s, which killed about 2 or 3 million each. At the moment, we're seeing deaths of about 320,000. Now, that's not that many, but the problem is we don't know quite what the mortality rate is. And when we look at something like Worldometer, we see that there are 5 million cases, but 320,000 deaths. That's a mortality rate of 6 or 7%, which is much, much higher than the previous pandemics. So there are some things that in sheer numbers, it doesn't actually look that big. In terms of potential, it's very dangerous, which is what is causing a lot of anxiety at the moment. But to try and put this into, as I say, some bigger economic context, what we wanted to do was look at and understand what the stock market impact of coronavirus has been, what the possible gross domestic product, GDP impact would be, and ultimately what the implications might be for brands coming out of all of this. And I think starting off with the stock market impact, again, it's very interesting to look at previous crises in the stock market. About nearly 20 years ago, we had the SARS epidemic, which saw the stock markets decline by about 15%. We had the dot-com bubble shortly before that, which had a 45% decline. And then the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933 saw an incredible, catastrophic 80% decline in stock market values. What we're seeing with COVID is about a 30% decline. If you look at the S&P 100, S&P 500, the FTSE 100, the MSCI index, the DAX and so on, they're all declined about 27 to 33%. And there's been a little bit of bounce back, and now it's kind of got stuck. The incredible thing and remarkable thing about COVID is this impact has been seen in just 1 month. It's incredibly quick compared to something like the Great Depression, which took 4 years to take full effect. So this has been incredibly quick, and it's quite unusual in that respect. And it seems as though that we might get a sort of short to medium term recovery over the next 2 to 3 years from what we've seen from the impact on the stock markets. One of the reasons we say this is that actually quite unusually there have been winners as well as losers. Normally when there's a crisis, everything in the stock market pretty much goes down together. What we've seen is a very distinct bifurcation between winners. We know food retailers and chemists are doing well, pharma companies, certain CPG companies, and of course many digital companies are doing very well also. On the other hand, we're seeing quite a lot of pain for banks and insurance companies and financial services. We're seeing an awful lot of automotive companies being hit very hard, in industrials. We've seen the extraordinary negative oil price, which has obviously hit the fossil fuel companies very hard. And then we've seen travel, tourism, leisure, and so on where we've had just a catastrophic 98% collapse in demand. But we do see winners as well as losers. So from this, we think there might be a sort of medium-term 2 to 3 year gentle upswing to recover the stock market losses. When we look at GDP impact, it's a slightly different story. Again, I think we have to go back in time to understand how to put this in context. When we go back to the Ebola virus, which was 2013 to 2015, which hit West Africa, we saw about an 8% decline in GDP over 2 years, which was pretty significant. We look at the financial crisis from 2008-09. Those economies hit were between sort of -4% and -7%. And when we look at the Great Depression, there was a 30% impact on GDP, a 30% decline in GDP around the world. What was interesting really for the financial crisis is it took quite a long time to recover from that. And when we look at the Great Depression, it actually really only recovered about 10 years after the event, basically because the Second World War caused productive capacity to pick up. So we see some quite extraordinary things in history. When we look at what coronavirus is doing, just interesting to compare it against the previous pandemics that I mentioned that caused many, many more deaths. Their GDP impact in relative terms was quite mild compared to coronavirus. We're thinking, for instance, in Hubei province, where the coronavirus started, they think they've had a 40% decline in GDP in Q1 2020. The UK is thinking we might have a 25% decline in Q2 2020. And depending on which economies you look at, somewhere between 10 and 20% is actually going to be the decline in GDP at a national level for the whole of 2020, which is incredibly significant. And there are a number of reasons behind this. As I said, the suddenness of this is quite remarkable. We haven't seen this kind of impact hitting quite so fast ever before. I think in particular, the lockdown is absolutely unprecedented. We may have seen in history before local or regional or city-based lockdowns, but to have entire national lockdowns and indeed international lockdown is something that we have never, ever seen before, and that is clearly having a massive impact on the economy. Equally and oppositely, we're also seeing some extraordinary government action. So the bailout programs that have been put into action incredibly quickly are things we haven't seen before. When we look, for instance, at the Great Depression, we see no movement in government debt. Here we see governments taking on debt as fast as they can. We've got the UK with a £300 billion programme, the Eurozone with a €600 billion programme, the US with the $3 trillion programme. These are sums that are actually even greater on average than those we saw with quantitative easing during the financial crisis. So the other thing that's really important is that we have at least kept our trading borders open, because the other problem with the Great Depression in the 20s was that mercantilist policies were followed. People stopped trading with each other, which not only worsened but prolonged the recession. Nevertheless, what we are seeing that overall, from a sheer number of deaths point of view, it's actually quite small. From a mortality rate, it's actually incredibly worrying. From a stock market point of view, the impact of coronavirus is, we've seen it before, it'll come back. But from a GDP point of view, we really have to go back 100 years to see anything quite like what we're seeing now. So it really is an extraordinary time we're living through. If we move on to the final part, but what are the implications for brands out of all of this? There are a number of things that strike us. I think, first of all, what are the implications for marketers? I think we need to be clear we're in it for the long haul. Marketing is often pointed towards doing things over the next 3 to 6 months and to push things as fast as possible and to move the dial over a short time frame. We really should now be planning to understand what happens over the next 3 to 6 years, because that's at least how long I think it is going to be before the economy gets back to normal, which means it's really vital to have the right strategic foundations around both the brand and the business to make sure that this recovery, or indeed this recuperation, takes place in the best possible manner. The second thing that we thought about was, what are the implications for consumers around all of this? We ran a bit of an analysis from our brand equity database called Brand Asset Valuator, which is the longest established and largest brand equity database in the world. And we looked at some data from the US, because that runs quarterly. what is fascinating is that we ask consumers what they look for in brands, what they value in terms of attributes, in terms of perceptions, and what they desire in terms of brands. We see some very significant uplifts in the attributes such as social, progressive, intelligent, and socially responsible. Up to a point, that's not entirely surprising, but it is a significant shift, and in many ways, that's accelerating what we know to be the case anyway with consumers, that they are looking for more social responsibility with brands. Perhaps more surprisingly, on the other side of the equation, we're seeing some very big declines in what are perhaps more rational attributes, but certainly those attributes that will be associated with market leadership. So we're seeing declines in leader, worth more, straightforward, and down to earth. So what consumers are looking for in their brands is changing actually quite markedly. Some of this will be short term, but we believe that some of this will also be long term as well. So ultimately, what are the implications for brand? I think a few things are really important. Firstly, brand equity remains as important as ever, perhaps even more so than ever. The consumers are looking for brands. They're looking for brands that are relevant. They're looking for brands that they can relate to. And in particular, they're looking for brands with greater purpose. Now, purpose has been around a long, long time, but I think that consumer desire for purpose has actually been accelerated and coalesced and embedded far faster in this crisis than it has over the last few years. The second thing is that there has been, to an extent, a rediscovery of forgotten brands, particularly thinking in an FMCG environment in terms of grocery retail. The consumer rush for tin products, for frozen products, rediscovering all those brands that you thought you had forgotten, you never thought you wanted again. But actually, in many ways, they represent tradition, comfort, familiarity, and actually they play a very valuable role for consumers. And I think last and most importantly of all, this is an incredible opportunity for challenger brands. We see that a lot of industries that were being disrupted anyway, again, are being disrupted at an incredibly accelerated pace, in particular things like travel, tourism, leisure and entertainment. We see that this creates that the industries are almost going back to square one, which creates an incredible opportunity for challengers to disrupt faster and to progress further. And the last point I'd make in terms of challenges is it also creates a challenge for established brands and market leaders to actually think in terms of being challenger brands themselves, because they are going to have to reconstruct categories, reconstruct markets, reconstruct demand, reconstruct businesses, reconstruct their brands. And I think this creates huge change in many, many categories, which is ultimately a challenge that will be met by stronger and stronger brands. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for listening. Really appreciate you dialing in. I hope that was useful. The next speaker will be at the top of the hour. That'll be at 5 p.m. UK time, and it'll be the Chief Creative Officer of Fitch, Tim Greenhalgh, and he will most definitely be well worth listening to. So I'd like to thank everyone, and also I'd like to thank the team at Landor&FITCH for putting this all together. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. We very much appreciate your time. Thank you also for your questions. Keep safe, keep well, and thank you ever so much for listening in today, and hopefully talk to many of you very soon.